Hey everybody. IPA followers, please take your seats. So now that we've completed the first part of the cocktail hour, I promise there won't be any testing or quizzes after this particular part. But I wanted to say I'm Jonathan Kirschenfeld, founder of the IPA. Very pleased to see all you folks here tonight. This is the second Q&A that we put on in our, I call it our church in the sky. There's a funny story attached to this. 4 or 5 years ago, I was at some sort of fair over at the National Arts Club. Saw this lovely brick loggia across the way, came over, knocked on the door of the church, asked, "What are you doing up there with that beautiful loggia? What happens up at that loggia?" And the gentleman said, "That's where we recycle and put our garbage." And I thought, well, I might as well make an immediate pitch. I said, "Listen, I think we can do better than that. My firm will come and design a rooftop garden for you in return for being able to use it occasionally for events." And so this is how we are here. And I do think it's a nice way. You know, this is a New York story, right? You knock on the door, you say, "What's going on up there?" And then you make something happen. So that's, I think, one of the aspects of the IPA that gives it energy. Anyway, I am very, very pleased to welcome a stalwart supporter of ours, Michael Kimmelman, tonight, who was, and I'm sure some of you were at our fall fete last year at the Brooklyn Historical Society. Michael was one of our honorees, along with Roseanne Haggerty. And talking with Michael tonight is Nadine Male, who's our brand new executive director, and Roseanne Haggerty and Nadine have been working together at Community Solutions for a while, so it's all sort of part of a beautiful family. Lastly, you know, our fete for 2015 is coming up. I know you've all gotten the wonderful blast, the eggplant and gray-colored invitation for our fete 2015, October 28th. You're all deputized to help us for that, meaning that we would like as many of you as possible to join the benefit committee. So before you leave tonight or on your way out, if you're interested in helping us to make this our most successful fete, please either grab me or grab Nadine and give us your email and let us know how many millions of dollars you think we can bring you. I'm going to hand over the mic to Nadine, and as long as Michael can talk and tell stories and answer questions, he will, but then afterwards there'll be more refreshments. So here you go.
Can you hear me? Is that all right? So thank you all for coming. I'm really excited. You can't hear? Oh, is that better?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Please do that if I start fading. So I actually would like to keep this very informal. I have a list of 20 questions here that you all have submitted. If you would like to stand up if I'm reading your question, please feel free to do so and elaborate on that question. And then afterwards, we will open it up if we have some time for additional questions that you all might have. I've arranged the questions, just so you know, into a few different buckets. One on affordable housing, one on planning, transportation, development sustainability, and then specific to Michael's column. But I think just to kick it off right now, we'll start with Michael just giving a little bit of a background on how he got to be where you're at, how you got to be where you're at.
Hi, thanks, Nadine, and hi, everybody. Thank you, Jonathan. It's a pleasure to be here. This is really amazing. Yes, can you guys hear me?
No. Can you hear me now?
Yeah. It's like a nightclub scene. How I got where I am? Well, I was born about 21 blocks south of here, and so I grew up in the village. I grew up in this very lefty household. So my parents were involved with lots of political things that were going on. You really can't get farther left than my family. I challenge you to try. And it was an interesting environment. I mention it because I think it implanted in me a couple of crucial seeds that really, in a certain sense, came to fruition now in this job, more so than what I was doing earlier. And the two things were that my father used to read the New York Times and circle articles in it and underline things and cut out stuff because he was convinced that it was run by the CIA, and that if you could read it closely enough, that it would be like a clue to what was actually going on in the market. And we used to have all sorts of journals. I was a regular reader of the Daily World. So I think that in my house there was a sense that a engaged public political conversation was a healthy thing. And that the New York Times was actually a kind of important place, even if it turns out not, so far as I know, to be run by the CIA. And then the second thing I think was that there was this feeling that the village was a place. It was a little bit like what Jane and Jake described. It was in many ways, but it was more than that. It was a place that had become. It was a mixed neighborhood. It was largely Italian where I was. It was a fundamentally middle class neighborhood. There were a lot of people who came there as people come to the city, and had come to the city not because it was a place of financial opportunity, but because it was a place of intellectual, creative opportunity. So it was a place for a physician like my father, who had other ideas about the world. My mother was a scholar. So I think it also embedded in me a notion of the connection between place and social well-being. I won't take you through a week-by-week growth, but I would say that what happened to me. I had a life for a little while as a musician. I kind of fell into doing art history because I was very interested in doing a kind of. I became very academic and was pursuing parallel to a career as a pianist, an academic career. I got very interested in sort of doing a cultural history that would engage in political history. And at the time, art history was a field that was at the forefront. Now it seems actually rather retrograde, sort of astonishingly so. So I became an art historian kind of by default. But I had this year interim between college and graduate school working at IT Magazine. And it was an incredibly important thing. I really fell into that job. But I was putting together half the magazine. So what had been a real interest for me in architecture and design, I had to learn how to write and edit commission pieces. I was deeply engaged in the field. So when I went to graduate school, I continued to do journalism. And I won't worry with all the details, but in effect, I kind of stumbled into getting hired to write for a newspaper. And within a couple of years, the Times hired me. And so I found myself as the chief art critic of the New York Times. I had no idea what I was doing. I was completely unqualified, and I had no intention of being the chief art critic of the New York Times. I didn't even read the chief art critic. What year was it? This was around 1990. Yeah, I mean, I think that the guy who had preceded me had been doing this since 1946 as the Sunday Times in London, and John Russell. Yeah, godfather of my older son. And but he had some strange faith that I could figure this out. So I spent some time trying to just not make it a complete ass of myself in public, and learning what it meant to be a newspaper critic. Touching my father, who lost his mind towards the end of his life, saw me work at the Times and decided, he said to me very tentatively, he said, "You know, the Times has gotten yellow."
So he wasn't worried that you joined the CIA?
No, he thought the Times had yellow. So that was very satisfying. But, you know, I wasn't really interested in the art world. So I spent a long time trying to figure out how to do that job, and then once I kind of got a hold of that, figuring out the way how to get out of it. And the reason was because, you know, I love art, and I love artists, and many of them are my friends, and people who write about art and art history, colleagues and friends. But the art world is not actually a place I feel particularly comfortable. It was never a world that interested me. And increasingly, as it became more focused, more increasingly narrow in its focus, internally focused on fashion and money, I didn't want to be the grouchy guy who was always complaining about this is not very interesting. And also, the process of criticism, I think this is relevant to what we're talking about here. In the 1940s and 50s, you had American critics like Clement Greenberg, Hess, and Rosenberg, and others, who were writing really on the barricades because contemporary art, especially contemporary American art in New York, was not yet institutionalized. So it was possible for a critic to speak, to get ahead of what was happening in the art world and to champion artists because there was no institutional support for it, and there was not a lot of money involved out there. Essentially, their argument was that it should become part of the larger conversation about art and should be collected by collectors and institutions. So what happened over the next 30 or 40 years, in effect, was that that argument was won. And increasingly, the critic who had played that role on the barricades came to play a role that was a much more rearguard role. And finally, at the ascent of the whole process. So if you're a critic now in the art world, you will go to see work that has already been brought up and marketed, and you have two choices. One is to either grease the wheels of that process or to try to throw a wrench in. Neither of them interested me very much, and so I think criticism has lost a lot of its meaning. Not to say there aren't people who do it who I like and admire, and Manchester is one of them who is, I think, doing the best that can be done now to drive a conversation in that field. But this is a long-winded way of saying I didn't think it was very interesting, and as a writer, which became my main goal, to write well, I exhausted that. So I looked for other ways to write, and to waste 5 more seconds, I finally persuaded the Times, which was allowing me to write for the magazine and the New York Review of Books a lot, which was very important to me, to send me abroad. And I kind of invented a column which got back to my original interest, and that is how to connect politics and social affairs to cultural questions. So I would travel around Europe and the Middle East and essentially have a column that was about whatever I wanted, and that often had a kind of doily of culture draped over it. So, for instance, I went to Gaza shortly after Hamas took over to answer a question: what is what is life like under Hamas? It seems to be a cultural question in that it could be answered as a way of how people live. What access do they have to media? What books do they read? What television shows do they watch? And so forth. And what do they make? So in that sense, it was a culture column, but it wasn't a culture column in the sense that I talked to artists or reviewed many shows. And so forth. But it was extremely satisfying. But it was also, I think, a stepping stone for me to come back and do this job. I won't fill in the blanks, but you can see that in many ways it was for me a very natural job to do. That in a sense I had been thinking about it and doing it, wanting to do it for a long time. I guess the only other thing I would say about it is that I think timing is very crucial in all things, but especially in this kind of a discipline in which you can argue something as much as you want, but if the conversation is really elsewhere, you're just not listened to. And I think that the climate has been changing, was changing. It's now almost 4 years. So that I would have written the same things 10 years earlier, but I think that the moment had arrived when it was possible to be heard, and there was an appetite for a change in the conversation. So I loved that.
Just going off of the script here. But so when you were working on the Hamas, who were your experts? Were those the folks that were living, or that were like residents, or who were the people that you spoke to kind of do your research?
In Hamas? With Hamas, I traveled to Gaza a bunch of times, and I talked to people who live in Gaza, and I talked to Hamas officials, and I just did basic reporting. Yeah, it was actually fascinating and fun. I mean, in some weird. I like this kind of work, so I tend to go to places that are often considered unusual places to go, or dangerous places to go, I guess, but it's not that hard. It interests me. I just think that you understand places only really when you go to them. This is, of course, a truism about architecture and our cities, but it's certainly true about places like that. Not to tie this back to my extraordinarily wonderful, amazing father, but I think that having grown up in an environment in which there was a lot of ideology, but often it was not tied to reality. One of the things that journalism provides is the ability to look at things in a granular way, and to take things apart into pieces. So, the opportunity to go to Gaza and meet Hamas officials and get to know. I've been back to Gaza maybe 3 or 4 times.
So I think we'll go into the affordable housing.
I'll tell you a really funny story about
please
Gaza.
do, yes.
I mean, if there's a funny story. So, I told you I was a little interested in what people watched and what people did. So everywhere I would travel around Gaza City and even in the south, I would see these posters and shop windows with outfits of women and scenes of this. It looked like some steamy soap opera, and it was in Arabic lure. And I began to wonder, what is this? And what it turned out to be is a Turkish soap opera that had become the rage of the entire Arab world. I mean, a pan-Arab phenomenon. So in Turkey, this soap opera, which had been called had been one of these, in these countries you have Turkey, Syria, Egypt, which make these series for Ramadan. And then they're broadcast during Ramadan and rebroadcast like with the... So this was one of those, called Burush, which then was translated by the Syrians and broadcast through the Arab as Noor. Trust me, this is going somewhere. And it had become this amazing phenomenon. The last episode of Noor was watched by, this is literally true, 3/4 of the entire Arab world. So, and in Gaza, this was interesting to me, that it was for them a window. The soap opera was about a rather well-to-do family that lived on the Bosphorus in Istanbul, with a woman, the starlet, was a young woman, who had her own business. But like many Muslim families, they were multi-generational home. So it was for these people trapped in Gaza a window onto another notion of Muslim life. A free and affluent one. In many ways progressive, but in many ways quite conservative. So it was a very important outlet. And I would go to this cafe, where people would sit and there would be like a sheet. It was very similar to this. They'd hang a sheet on one end, and they would broadcast all these things that people could watch together. So you check your guns at the door, and you'd come in, and there'd be these families sitting around having meals, watching Friends and Oprah and Noor. And so I went to speak to the head of the television network in Gaza, who was a Hamas guy, who was an interesting character. He was very muscular, kind of thick-set, with two conspicuous holes in his arms, in his forearms, where he'd either been shot or strung up, sort of crucified. I didn't ask him about that, but I did ask him about Noor. And as I started to ask about Noor, his 16-year-old son came into the room. Now this is a Hamas official, a very high-ranking Hamas official. And his son comes into the room, and he says, this is my son. I said, huh? Well, I'm just talking to your father now about Noor. Do you watch Noor? And he says, Noor is an abomination. And it is a horrible thing that people watch Noor. You see women dressed without headscarves, and the music is horrible, and it gives a horrible lesson, and I tell my sisters that she cannot watch Noor. I prevent my sister from watching this. It is horrible that people watch Noor, and we should ban Noor. His father, who's, like I said, not a smiley person. And I said, so you'd never watch Noor? He said, I would never watch Noor. I pray when Noor is on. At which point, his mobile phone rings. So of course, the ringtone is the theme song to Noor. Oh my God, he said, no, this is my sister's cell phone. It's not my phone. I tell you this incredibly long story because it was such a beautiful little window onto this. And I looked at his father, who of course was beaming at this embarrassment. It tells you a lot about what's going on there, about the kind of close. So it was that kind of thing that I felt was very important to see firsthand, and you can't really know it unless you... Sorry.
No. I know, I feel horrible actually. I'm just going to jump right in because we have to, but we might go back to this. Oh, is this better? I'm sorry, thank you. Yes, we are going to turn off the volume. Yes.
Did you hear anything of what I said?
I don't think that
Because if not, I'll repeat the whole story.
Is this better?
Yes.
Yes? Okay, thank you. On a subject that you've written about, on affordable housing, can you speak about design relating to public housing, specifically in New York City? And do you think there's any hope for better thinking around design and affordable housing in New York?
Well, I think the big issue at the moment, right, is that this administration is so intent on numbers. So they're backing off a little bit this 200,000 figure, but that, what is it, was 120,000 preserved and 80,000 new apartments. So they're obviously scrambling for whatever they can. I don't think they care, frankly, at all about quality of the design or doing particularly good architecture. And I think the notion of a project like Villa Verde or Sugar Hill is out. Now, that doesn't mean that they won't do really good things and interesting stuff, but I don't believe that we're going to see anything like that under this administration. So then the question becomes, you know, how successful are they at this 80,000, and where will it come? And we can certainly talk about that. I mean, I think another question related to that is, you know, why isn't affordable housing here often better or more creative than it is? And I think there are two ways of answering that. One is, and they're contradictory. One is to say, actually, a lot of affordable housing in the city is a lot better than we give it credit for. And I think there's a lot of public housing in the city which has actually been quite good. It's typical, you know, Stuyvesant Town is fine and Penn South is fine, but the exact same housing, when it's not well maintained and it's run by Nitro, looks terrible. So I don't think that's the fault of the architecture. But there are certain problems here that we face that we don't have in other parts of the country.
So you say if the 80,000 that the mayor is planning on the new construction, good design doesn't necessarily need to cost more. So what do you think the impediments are for the administration to create good design that's affordable versus support good design that's affordable?
Well, it doesn't necessarily cost more, but I think one of the questions that somebody asked was about why is there more good design on the West Coast than there is here, and obviously a lot of that has to do with construction costs. I mean, construction costs here are high. On the West Coast, you can build affordable housing. Much of it is, you know, 5 stories with timber above concrete. You have a lot of porous buildings. You can do a lot more there. Here, we want to maximize every square foot of available land. So it's very, you know, that puts a lot of strain on designers. And so it's harder to be creative, and I think there's less margin, financial margin here too. We can be good, and we should be good at this. You know, I still believe that design excellence program that had been turning out post offices and well, actually not post offices, the libraries, the firehouses from the DDC was a good thing. It still exists, and I hope that the administration does not abandon it. But I think it's probably not feeling much love at the moment. So, you know, we'll have to see. I really don't get a sense from this administration that they think that design is important. And I understand they have an enormous, they've created an enormous burden for themselves. And it's hard to know where 80,000 units are going to come from. And they're having trouble even figuring out one neighborhood in East New York.
So then what's your take on developers? Like, this is a question, if the person who wrote this question is here, please elaborate, but developers like L&M who operate, to quote, business-like but have philanthropic likes that are socially friendly. Is the person here who wrote this?
Yeah,
so I guess a little bit on developers.
Yeah, I mean, I had to look up a little, because I was alerted to this question, so I was looking into L&M a little bit. You really can hear me? And you know, look, my take, without knowing this deeply, is that L&M, this is great, what L&M is doing. It's not alone, obviously. There are other people, Jonathan Rose and others, who have figured out ways to make doing affordable housing and other kinds of subsidized development economically profitable, and do good work. My impression of what L&M is doing is that working with this NYCHA housing stock and Rockaways and elsewhere, that they've been able to retrofit this and make real improvements and find sources of income, which of revenue that make it good for them. The key concern, obviously, of tenants in these places is that if to the extent that these projects become partly under the control, or fully, ultimately, under the control of a private developer like L&M, how vulnerable is the affordability? But as I understand it, their profits come from the very subsidies that they get from the Section 8 housing, for instance. So they don't want to undo this. That is where the money will come from. And in any case, these projects are renewed by Congress. It would be Congress that would have to undo the affordability. So I don't think the privatization issue seems to be, although it's obviously a concern for tenants, seems to be the big concern. So this seems like a very good thing. It raises another question, though, about public-private ventures. And I don't know how deeply we want to get into this now, but this comes up all the time, and especially, I'm sure for all of you as well, when one travels, you hear this interest in New York's emphasis under the Bloomberg administration, public-private partnerships, and what that can produce, both in terms of something like housing, affordable housing, but also parkland, open space, and so forth. And I think the controversy you now see, for instance, at Brooklyn Bridge Park, over what's happening at Pier 6, which was always going to happen at Pier 6, is, in a way, it reminds me of people who go out to a really fancy restaurant and they buy all this stuff and order fancy wines, and then the bill comes and it's like, well, my God, I had no idea. This was, I'm not saying that makes it okay, or that there aren't other ways around what's happening at Pier 6, or that there weren't a lot of people who didn't like this from the beginning. But I think this public-private ventures are always something we need to scrutinize very carefully and understand well going in. Seems like an obvious thing to say, but the desire to just get a project going and the availability of private interests, of private money to finance it, is so attractive in such a sclerotic and difficult environment that we can undertake these projects before fully understanding that no private interest is going to get involved in this unless there is profit to be made at the other end. Why should there? So, these come with mixed benefits, which may be well worth, pursuing it. Yeah.
Now, NYCHA is pursuing exactly this public-private partnership game under a new administration, and so given what we've seen with Bloomberg and what we know about De Blasio now, what are your thoughts on this?
I think the issue with NYCHA, look, I think it depends on each of these cases, and so I don't want to say blanket it's all okay, but I think what I hear a lot of this is that you're dealing with an administration at NYCHA which is really not very capable of moving to next-gen housing. And so, although it's got 1 million people working for it, it seems to, want to have input from outsiders, some of them here. I think that's probably a good thing. And NYCHA's obviously, one of the most broken systems in the city. And I think there's a big difference between what L&M is doing, or what Graham and Nathan were proposing, and what Bloomberg wanted to get done in a hurry at the end of the administration, which is just build market-rate housing desperately to find a way to save NYCHA. So what can you say? Do we think that Pier 6 is a bad thing, for instance? I don't think there is a straight, easy answer to these questions when you enter into these equations. I can give you my answer to Pier 6, but I think the short of it is, you play with the devil, you get what you get. So, is that an answer?
So New York City's next. Sorry. 7. Okay. Next hot neighborhood has always been East Harlem or the South Bronx, Greenpoint, Red Hook. What's your favorite emerging neighborhood? And where do you see the next logical forefront for development?
Philadelphia. No, I listen. I mean, Philadelphia's cooked. Yeah, it's done. Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. I don't know. I mean, I really, look. Who can say? Astoria. You know, I think the interesting thing about New York. I was telling friends to move to Queens like 10, 15 years ago. And in some ways because I think Queens reminded me very distantly, but a little bit, of what I had loved about the village. It was a very diverse place. Queens is far more diverse than the village ever was, but that was the thing that seemed wonderful about Queens. And, you know, and I lived over the Damascus Bakery on Atlantic Avenue in Brooklyn. So I have some Brooklyn bona fides, a little. I lived with the smell of spinach pie for one thing and months out. And so, you know, I kind of get Brooklyn, but I still think Queens is a place of enormous potential. And if I were moving somewhere now, that's where I would look. But for whom and at what price range? What were we talking about? I mean, I think you know, the most interesting thing, in some ways, that's happened since the last session was you have what is like 300,000 tech jobs moving to New York, and 85% of them move into renovated, existing buildings. So you have this amazing kind of rejuvenation. It's not produced a lot of new architecture, but that's because a generation that is of tech workers and tech owners and startups don't really want to live like madmen on Park Avenue, and they want to live in neighborhoods that are real neighborhoods, and so they're looking more towards places like, obviously Dumbo and Williamsburg, but also I think Queens is going to seem more attractive to them for the same reasons. Washington Heights, by the way, that's probably a good answer. It's a good place for more affordable housing, for more mixed income affordable. Is this me doing this?
So, Killian, I'm going to call you out on the Queens thing. Did you have any comments or anything you wanted to share on Queens? Follow-up question?
Jackson Heights. Jackson Heights.
It's great.
About 5 years ago would have been the time to buy. Flushing, but Flushing also becoming more and more actually like the trend.
Yeah, it's
pretty
true.
sure it will be Inwood, Jamaica. It'll keep pushing east.
You know, look, this is
East Bronx.
Yeah. What?
East Bronx, Parkchester.
Yeah, so the Bronx, I mean, all of this, right, depends upon the ability of this administration to think in a holistic way. So it's not just about housing, it's also about transit and about schools. And so, you know, I'm sorry, I'm coming back to Pier 6. What's the real issue in a place like that? It's that you have development like the library at Cadman Plaza, which I think is a good idea. But again, it's a sale of private land, of public land for private development. Plus what's happened at Brooklyn Bridge Park, plus Litch. And there's not enough room at schools, there's not additional transit. So what's really missing is an integrated approach towards the city, something that thinks about not just one thing in an isolated way. And this is, of course, true. The Bronx is, is amazing, but we need as well networks. Parts of the Bronx are fantastically connected, far better than any place in Queens. But there are other areas, the East Bronx and so forth, which need to be better connected. And those places need whatever it is, bus rapid transit or other kinds of new transit. And I think those are every bit as important as housing. And they will, that's how New York was built. I mean, it's saying that, I know I'm preaching the converted, but as all of you know, this is not a universally understood idea. And this administration, I don't think is, moving nimbly on multiple fronts. So I wrote about the recent bus rapid transit across 86th Street, but that was a kind of I did it because it was the first one they were able to get done. It had started already. It was an easy one. We should be having lots of these done. Woodhaven is great when it happens. It's a full dress, you know, rapid bus plus thing, but that's not enough. It's not good enough. So yeah, the Bronx, absolutely. Washington Heights, you know, Inwood and Bayside. But meanwhile, we need to be able to get in and out of these places as well.
So following up on that, so what? Can people hear me? Okay. What are your thoughts on ride sourcing, like Uber and those sorts of things?
Yeah, I laugh because I did a panel for this New York Times conference that I organized, and I had David Clough, and I had the Secretary of Transportation, Anthony Fox, and I had Jeanette Zedekon. And so Clough was right. This was the day before de Blasio backed down, and in fact, I have to say that I think one thing that may have also helped him back down was that we also did a panel in which Doctoroff and Alicia Glenn talked. And, you know, as on my panel, Doctoroff as well said, you know, signals count. And Alicia clearly was very bothered by this, but the message that was coming across from almost everybody was, of course, the city has every right to control its streets and control the number of cars and so forth. But it's probably not a healthy thing for New York to send a signal that's not welcoming to new industry. And Jeanette defended above all the right of the city to Jeanette, who's of course an innovator, was also saying, of course everybody loves Uber, it would be great, but we have to be able to, the city needs to be able to regulate what happens in the streets. I agreed with all this, but I never took Uber. I decided I wasn't going to do Uber. I just thought it was not right. And then, like a couple of days after the conference, just a week or so ago, I went out to Silicon Valley and I downloaded the Uber app because I needed to. I was in San Francisco. I mean, why we are not all taking Uber every minute of the day. We do. It's just the greatest thing to do. So, what are you going to say? I mean, no, I think it's actually an interesting case, right? Because this is one of the the Internet of Everything is basically a way that the now large companies, Google, Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Amazon, you know, that they get all of our information to sell it to their real clients, persuading us that it's actually for us, that we are really the beneficiaries of all this stuff we're giving them. We're like we're the serfs on the, you know, tilling little farms on the duchies, and we think that the dukes really care about us personally. But so Uber is another one of these things. I mean, and yet one has to say that these are undeniable benefits to the affluent class, and so we have to deal with them. I mean, there's no way that you can say Uber is can't be welcome in New York. And by the way, I think Uber's argument, which Clough made brilliantly, because it completely outflanked de Blasio on the left and made him look like a lumbering, old-school Democrat, was we serve the outer boroughs, and we provide work for lots of people who live in those outer boroughs as well. It's also true. I mean, not full-time jobs, and that's a whole issue that needs to be settled. Yeah. So I'm an Uber member up to a point.
Since you were mentioning class, someone wrote in a question that I really hope that the person who wrote this question can actually elaborate on, because I think we both need some elaboration. So many of the recent incidents between police officers and African Americans began as traffic incidences, and does the traffic industry bear some responsibility for these incidents? Are there traffic rules which tend to be abused by authorities? Should we simply have automatic enforcement? The person's here who wrote this, if this isn't doing the question justice, let me know, but that is the question. Okay. Okay.
No, but I think the part that, so I'm trying to parse it a little bit. So is it about race, or is it just about enforcement? In other words, is it about pedestrian trespass, pedestrians doing jaywalking, or is it about a particular way in which the police choose to enforce traffic rules?
So we've created, you talk about transportation, you talk about traffic, and you're right about it. And the Americans we created in America a system that is very automobile oriented. And we have basically outlawed, except for New York City, walking. And Michael Brown was stopped by the police for walking in the middle of a cul-de-sac. For no other, but that was the beginning of the engagement. There are other incidences where the police have engaged people because they were breaking, they were breaking some sort of traffic rule. So what I see is that the police can use our traffic rules to do whatever they do.
So, right. So I've been thinking about this a little bit because I'm very interested in race and space, as we all are, I think, and trying to understand, so much of the civil rights movement was fought over public space, the equal opportunity in public space. It wasn't public space, whether it was public water fountains, restrooms, luncheonettes. And it is true that so many of these incidents take place in public spaces. I'm not sure they all take place in traffic-related spaces. They may take place in a public housing project, as happened in Brooklyn. They may take place in a public park, as happened in Cleveland. They may take place in the opposite of a public space, like a gated community, where Trayvon Martin was killed. Or they may take place on a sidewalk, which is near traffic, as on Staten Island. And I think that this is, and I'm happy to talk about that at greater length, and how we need to think about this. But I think you raise other issues which are not necessarily race-related, and that is obviously about our inclination towards cars, our predilection towards cars and not over pedestrians. And we will all recall that when Vision Zero started, the police began to give tickets to pedestrians, not to drivers. I am very much of the idea that we need to blow up the whole notion of the way streets are oriented. Now, I have to admit that I've never owned a car, which is the benefit of growing up here, and gives me a strange link to a generation to which I don't belong, but of people I see out in places like Los Angeles, kids who don't own cars and don't want to and have every intention of taking bikes and public transit out there. So I'm not a car person, but I love driving, and I get the benefits of cars. That said, if you walk down 80th Street from the Museum of Natural History, that I've done with my children, you're walking down a very narrow, cracked sidewalk next to what is effectively 4 lanes of traffic that is almost unused, 2 for parking, and usually 1 car is going down. And families and other people are jammed onto this tiny little island of strip sidewalk. Well, who decided that was a good idea? We don't even think about it anymore. This is the way the whole city is designed, to allow cars to occupy the majority of our public space. So, it's not just about enforcing laws in those situations, that I think is a complex and important question, but it's about changing, I think, gradually our notion of who owns this space and how we want that space to be apportioned. I think we're beginning to, right? So this has happened in the last few years. I think the bike lane stuff and in Vision 02 and the rapid bus stuff, and all this is beginning to turn a corner. It's very slow, and I think it'll take a long time.
Well, the avenue, when I grew up, the avenue was too big.
Right.
So, the change of Fifth Avenue was ceremonial.
Right.
I remember when it came to drive up Fifth Avenue again, two-way traffic became the main.
I'll repeat what you're saying. You're saying that the avenues used to be 2 ways, and that's absolutely true. Yeah, which was a traffic calming thing and would help.
But when it changed, it was a major change in the vibe.
Right.
I mean, it wasn't like university players, it was changed in direction of that.
So this is true, that it was a change in the, repeat what you said, it was a change when it was about creating highways through the city. I mean, I think we should really think seriously about pedestrianizing avenues in the city. There are ones that would be obvious. Lafayette, you could pedestrianize Riverside, parts of it anyway. I mean, you could pedestrianize West End. We could try. I mean, I think we could do worse than to see what happens. We did, Times Square is it was such a radical move, and so complicated and so compromised, and that it's an odd example to have of the possibility of doing that. But I think we could go much farther. One of the reasons this administration is taking so long over things like bus rapid transit routes is because they're very concerned about building consensus. I admire this, but those 4 guys from Bayshore are never going to want to give up those 4 parking spots. They're never going to say it's okay, and you're not going to get them to say so, even if 100,000 other people benefit from this. So at a certain point, you just have to say, this is for the better, the greater good. This is what a city is about. And we have to make these decisions. They're hard ones, and we need a leadership that's focused on it. So, we'll either get that now or get it later.
What are your thoughts on the administration leveraging the opportunities about achieving 80% greenhouse gas reduction by 2015 in regards to retrofitting existing buildings? And
I don't know a lot about it, but the little I know is, it has great potential, and I think it could do really good things and could produce some really good architecture in the process. We'll have to see how that goes. But yes, that's a good thing. It should be used as a mechanism to improve the architecture. And we've seen retrofitted buildings which make a big difference. There's this project I think L&M is doing in Rockaway, which I haven't seen firsthand. It sounds quite interesting. So there are ways we can use that, leverage that. Yeah.
So I'm going to maybe close it up with one last formal question and then open it up to everyone. So it's kind of a fun one. If you weren't doing your current job, what would your alternate life be?
One thing I never thought of. What would my alternate life be? Yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure I want to say. But actually, honestly, I really feel, I mean this in all seriousness, I really feel very lucky. I do. I mean, I love living in Europe. I love doing what I was doing. But, I get to come back to my city, and which really is the most interesting place I know. And to give myself the illusion that I can participate in a larger conversation about the improvement of that city. It's not a small thing. I don't take it lightly. I really don't. And I think that in the world of journalism, that doesn't really happen very often. Look, I mentioned that career as an art criticism because I know what it's like to be in a supposedly very powerful position that feels more or less meaningless. I think this is a remarkable opportunity I have, and I hope I'm not squandering it, and I don't particularly want to give it up. I mean, if you're asking me, are there other ways I could do this particular job that might have a wider impact? I think there are, and I hope I can explore those. But it's not like I wish I were in, Monaco driving a Lamborghini, and that's not actually my fantasy.
About your band?
Yeah, I could go around with my band. No, I take it seriously, and by the way, and this is not meant in a lighthearted or cavalier or all disingenuous way, but I really I think it's very important to get feedback and to know if I am actually making some difference and writing about the things that matter. I mean, maybe I'm talking to an audience of people who are already interested in the things I'm writing about, but I think there's a way that you can lose touch. One of the problems with being in a position like mine is people can tell you things that they think you want to hear, and what I want to hear is what needs to be written about, and what I should be doing, and what I'm doing right or wrong. Not too much wrong, but I mean it. I think it's important. And I came back and talked to people, and Jonathan was one of them, people who I wanted to hear from to know what was important to write about. That's critical to my job. If I feel like I'm just operating on my own, that's not interesting, and it makes me worry that I'm losing touch. So that's all my way of saying, if you want to tell me what I should be doing, aside from jumping off the load joke.
I have a question about, it's always referring to housing in outer boroughs and how to solve a problem with low-income housing. But maybe it's not about them being outer boroughs, but more about the infrastructure there developing office and commercial space in those boroughs, so we don't have this transportation to the central inner borough, and like in upzoning commercial greatly in Queens and working parts of Brooklyn. If you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, so this is already, I think, happening to some extent, that you have multiple nodes. This is no longer a city in which everyone comes into Manhattan or wants to come into Manhattan. The subway system is constructed more or less, not literally radially, but with the idea that everyone had to ultimately feed into the middle. So this creates these transit gaps, which rapid transit and other forms of, perhaps might talk me idea of a trolley going up the Brooklyn, Queens waterfront can solve, or at least help. But I think I think these multiple nodes do need to be developed, and therefore the administration also needs to encourage commercial development in these areas. The interesting thing about the Brooklyn Bridge Park stuff is that the Watchtower buildings really make they make potential residential development that could throw off money to prevent new luxury towers at the park. But actually, we need more of that kind of existing and new construction for commercial development. So I'm 100% with you, and I think the city is moving in that direction. Both because it's logical, and because I think a lot of people who move to the city no longer see Manhattan as the magnetic center. It's out there with its own characteristics. So yeah, I'm just with you 100%. That again comes from a holistic thinking, which is never, we don't plan in the city, so we don't begin with the question of what mix of things do we want in neighborhoods. We're very much about one-off, and even in East New York, let's see how mixed that development really is. I'm very anxious to know what will happen there. If it's not, which it may be, already too late. Sorry.
I do have a question. Sorry, I do have a question. But first, I wanted to say you were great in Seymour.
I was great in Seymour. Thank you.
Documentary film. Really that's the first time I actually saw you speaking, so
yeah.
that was kind of cool. It's sort of a narrow question, but I know you've already written about the development on the north side of the campus at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've been back to see the building under construction, but I'd like, one, to know your thoughts on that, but also the dilemma, which you referred to in the article about the cathedral needing money and then making this kind of, in my view, mistake.
Yeah, so first of all, Seymour, thanks. There's a movie which I can't help but then encourage you all to see, because it's a lovely movie made by Ethan Hawke about my piano teacher called Seymour. And I would not do this promotion because it's stupid, except that the movie turned out entirely unexpectedly. I thought this was going to be a complete calamity, and did almost everything I could to tell Seymour not to participate in this. It's turned out to be the most astonishingly successful, and probably will win the Academy Award this year. So anyway, go see this movie. Yes, I was happy in the end to be in it. So thank you. The St. John Divine Development is an interesting case about all this church land. I wrote about it hoping that they would not follow through on this plan to build this thing, which Dan Brodsky is now in charge of, which is a mixed development, but mostly market rate rentals. A building on the north side of St. John. So does everyone here know the St. John campus? So you know they built that tower on the southeast corner of the campus, which is at 110th Street, which is horrible. And then the problem here was that it kind of ruined the view of the north face, which is really very beautiful. And my thought was, look, you can't really prevent them from doing development because what other source of income do they have? We don't allow the transfer of their rights, which is, I think, the answer to your question. So I came up with this cockamamie idea that they should go ahead with this large tower that would follow through on the original, with variation on the original plan. It would have made the church a lot more money. It would have made Dan a lot more money. It would have taken up a lot less ground space, a much smaller footprint. But it would have required years of more urban community stuff, so they weren't going to go there. The one thing I have to say is that I go there all the time, so I see it a lot. It's not as bad as I feared it would be. It's very mediocre, but it is set back from the north facade more than I had perceived, so that one can there's still space there, and especially if that space is kept open. So, I think it's a loss. I think it's an unfortunate thing. It turns out to be not a tragedy. I don't think it's the worst piece of architecture that's gone out, and I do think it's not cheek by jowl with the church. But would it have been better if that could have been preserved as parkland? Obviously, 100%. What can one say? You win some, you lose some. Gotta keep trying. Yeah.
There's a big difference between architecture and planning.
Yeah.
And, I said there's a grave schism between architecture and planning. And New York really has some history of having roots of integrating really severe architectural concepts with potential plans. In the case of Olmsted's work, et cetera, et cetera. So we are the city that was a democratic, non-monarchical society that activated architectural urbanism as opposed to just planning, like the Greenbelt and the Carnegie Libraries, all of those things which we did an exhibition about for the AI at the 150th anniversary. Now I'm going to reveal something about myself, which is my father was one of the people that started the real estate section of the Herald Tribune when your father was an architect at the Times. And I was dragged from one construction site to another as a child and met Levin and all these people. Now at that time, what everybody vilifies now as the modern movement was actually on everyone, but these developers were very conversant in issues. Now the biggest issue that I can point out at this particular moment in regard to all the things that have been discussed is that both Franco and Michael Kimmelman were interested in the fact that because we have this schist underneath us, that we've never used buildings to have stratified sectional transformations of program, which is one of the most weird aspects of Manhattan. Or of all our buildings that we can go up high, but we never put a school and a museum, and in someplace commercial, integrate like you've got a grocery store on the 30th floor, like in the Marseille block, which everybody vilifies. So there are architectural concepts that are so powerful that have never been integrated into, and so, know, a lot of architects get involved in social welfare arguments, this, that, what a good mixed neighborhood is, and all of it. But it's not architectural argument. So you're kind of making, one makes the architect's impetus and separates design from conceptualization and structure. And that goes for civic, the idea of building housing without a civic program in the housing is a debilitation of the housing. Successful housing has a church in it, or a school, or a museum. And the issue of the program is the thing that we've taken it out of the design world. And at the same time, the structural issues of what's indigenous to our fabulous structural condition have never been explored. And the argument, you say you want to hear about the argument. I say, I've read enough articles by the previous critic at the times about Disney and Frank Gehry, who knew what Frank ate for breakfast every day before you became a critic. But the point is, it was that specifically the design was a particular style. And then you came and you've opened it up in a different way, but still, there's a legacy here that hasn't been explored.
No, I appreciate that, and I appreciate that, and that's a longer conversation which we can have, and I think you're right. And I think that also the notion of architecture therefore came to be understood in the public's mind in a very narrow sense. Yeah, and one of the questions you didn't ask, but that had been asked is, to what extent, why does the public not necessarily have a good image of designers and architects? And I think this contributes to it in the sense that I think the field gave itself over to the idea that it was an extension of sculpture, and therefore it was a luxury item that it didn't pertain to them, that had no meaning to their daily lives. I think that's a very good point. In terms of, a grocery store like in Marseille, having a grocery store in a higher floor. This is a very interesting question, and you're absolutely right. We haven't really pursued it, and the school and so forth. I think there are it's a long conversation why that doesn't happen, but there's no reason why it shouldn't, and it certainly happens. At least on the ground floor level, we accept the notion that you have retail or a school or something, but as you get higher, that disappears. It's an interesting idea of verticality. But one of the things I think that may partly relate to that is how much people want to be in a kind of open space. I think one of those powerful things that happened to me when I came back was the Occupy movement, because it made very transparent the relationship between social and political desires and open space. And in fact, it expressed a notion of a more ideal polis through an open space. And that's hard to simulate or to adapt in a. But it's just, I take your point, I think it's a good one. So we'll continue that part of the conversation.
When was the last time that
Go repeat the question.
When was the last time New York really worked in what period during the 20th century did New York really work in a progressive fashion? What period do you idealize? And what period, and how can you learn from that?
When did New York really work in a progressive way, and what do I idealize? I've never thought about that, and I've never really thought, we got things totally right when there was, the government was spending a lot of money on public housing, or, we really understood things when Carnegie did, inaugurated the libraries. I've never thought of it as, I think New York has always been a kind of organic mixed place in which each era has contributed some very important things. When I came back from Europe and saw what had happened under Bloomberg, I saw it in a way with fresh eyes because I'd been gone for years, and so it was very striking to me, quite remarkable. And the way we reclaimed parts of the waterfront, the way we had, added these bike lanes, the cities was just cleaner and shinier and so forth. On the other hand, you know, I can't say that the principles that operated under Bloomberg were universally good. There isn't a period I look back on as being the ideal one. There are things we did, which I think we do need to look back on as paradigms. The grid. I mean, that's unbelievable. Across multiple generations, this extraordinary commitment to, I mean, we can hardly get through 2 or 3 years without, you know, turning over everything we did before. The idea that from, you know, 1810 until the 20th century, we continue this project is just unbelievable. And of course, the libraries and the public library system, which I think we've failed to recognize for many years as one of the greatest, maybe the greatest philanthropic gift ever. Now we see how crucial they are to the lifeblood of the city, to immigrants and so forth. So, I mean, there are many things we need to look back on in public housing as well. But I don't think, oh man, the 1950s they were rocking. It was really great. I don't think that's the way the city's ever worked. A particular administration like LaGuardia? Yeah, I mean, sure. I prefer LaGuardia to Beam. You know, we'll see what happens with de Blasio. I'm hopeful but concerned.
It's interesting because, you know, de Blasio is still very dependent on these, you were talking about these public-private partnerships.
Right.
He's sort of working through that.
Right. So, I mean,
LaGuardia was
very good. That's a very good point. It's a very good point.
And he was working with these public solutions.
Right. So this is a very good point that so this is what I meant about the public-private stuff.
His whole economic development team is like Goldman Sachs.
Yeah.
And then now he's starting to change it. He's got to do what
yeah, I mean, let's not get carried away. But I mean, I think de Blasio is following through in many ways on a model of public-private development, and the idea of giving developers incentives to provide some measure of affordable housing. How we got to the idea that that's the only way, what about just the government building housing? No, I think that's a very good point. On that, I agree. There is a model in the past, and I asked that question to Carl Weisbrot directly, and I think it's one of these things in which you're so in a system that you can't see your way out of it. I mean, I tell you that Steve Ross, for instance, is really happy with the administration right now, and will tell you so, because he likes these incentives. They work for him. That's great. I want developers to do well, but I'm not sure why the government got out of the business of actually building housing themselves.
It's like the public pools in their city.
Yeah.
Imagine them building something like the McCarran Pool today.
Right. The real idea of building McCarran Pool today. Right. We're not, I can't at all disagree with you. I think that's great. But when you raise the notion of these ideas as public, so let me finally end with Pier 6. It's been on my mind because I've been talking to these people with Regina and others, and I think I wanted to use it as an example of NIMBYism. But I think it's not entirely an example of NIMBYism, so it's causing me trouble. I don't really know what I'm going to do with it. But I'll tell you, just to refresh your memory, Brooklyn Bridge Park began as a public-private venture. Public money up front, private money to raise to support it. Obviously the park is what it is. And now that the private development is coming in, many people are very unhappy with it. And one of the responses is, well, the city should just pay to support the park. Now, this is true in a way. Of course, we should be supporting our parks. We should be giving more money to parks and to libraries. And I think this is part of a social compact in other in Europe. These sort of things are understood. But this is not the way we work any longer, and getting back to something closer to that way is going to take time and a lot of arguments. And I think Brooklyn Bridge Park is in a way an illustration of the costs and benefits of a system that is not based entirely on public benefit, but needs to lean public benefits on private good, on private profits. would disagree. I don't think that in an ideal world we would have the public taxes pay for all of our parks, maintaining our streets, making better subways, and extending the public transit system. All this is true, but you know why that's not happening. And so how can we incrementally move towards a system that is more geared towards these kind of public benefits? I think it begins by defining what those benefits are, because we lost track. I think we lost track of the benefits of libraries. I think we lost track of the benefits of parks and open space. I think we lost track of the need for affordable housing. It's going to take time, I think, to get back to an understanding of what the balance should be. But I mean, nobody in this room, and probably Steve Ross wouldn't disagree with you, that, you know, in an ideal world, we would get back to a system where the government's paying for that and private developers do what they do. One more, are we done? Jonathan says no, and you're raising your hand.
Great.
Thank you.